The last known footage of Nancy Guthrie, does it reveal the killer's ID? This as the Nancy Guthrie killer's route.
Modern vehicles are essentially computers on wheels, and they remember everything. That's why the Uber ride that brought Nancy Guthrie home on January 30th matters so much. For weeks, while investigators focused on the obvious evidence, the doorbell camera footage, the timeline established by her Apple Watch, the physical evidence at her home, they overlooked a crucial witness, the driver who transported Nancy during what may have been the last hour of her freedom. That vehicle captured her demeanor, her physical condition, what she was wearing. But more importantly, depending on the vehicle's camera system, it may have captured something else entirely, something in the background. A car that seemed to be following, a vehicle parked where it shouldn't be, a person watching from the shadows. Death investigator Joe Scott Morgan, who's worked more than 10,000 cases over his career, puts it simply. When you're investigating a crime against someone with limited mobility, someone dependent on others for transportation, the vehicles involved become central to everything. You need to know every car that came near the victim, every driver who had contact, every route taken, every deviation from the normal pattern. Because the perpetrator's vehicle is out there somewhere, and in the digital age, it's nearly impossible for a car to move through an urban environment without being recorded. The question becomes, are you looking at the right footage? Nancy Guthrie's life in Tucson was defined by routine and limitation. At 84, with a fragile heart condition requiring daily medication and monitoring through a pacemaker, she'd reached that stage of life where independence becomes negotiable, where the simple act of going to dinner requires planning and assistance. She lived in a quiet Tucson retirement community, the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where the pace of life slows to match the desert heat, where an 80-year-old woman should be able to live out her years in peace and security. But retirement communities, for all their gates and security protocols, operate on trust. They're designed to keep strangers out, not to defend against someone who's studied the patterns, learned the routines, identified the vulnerabilities. Nancy's daughter Annie lived nearby with her husband. Family dinners were common, unremarkable, part of the normal rhythm of their lives. January 30th started like countless evenings before it. Nancy was picked up, driven to Annie's home, shared a meal with family, spent time with the people she loved. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. No indication that someone was watching, counting down the hours, preparing to execute a plan that had likely been weeks in the making. Around 9 that evening, the family called an Uber to take Nancy home. Her son-in-law could have driven her, often did drive her, but on this particular night they chose the convenience of a ride service. That decision, random and unremarkable at the time, now carries enormous investigative weight. The Uber driver who picked up Nancy Guthrie that night had no idea he was about to become a crucial witness in a kidnapping investigation. He simply saw an elderly woman who needed a ride home, probably no more than a 10 or 15-minute drive through quiet Tucson streets. But what his vehicle recorded during that journey matters immensely. Investigators need to see Nancy's physical state when she left Annie's house. Was she steady on her feet, alert and conversational? Did she appear ill or disoriented? These details matter because they establish her baseline condition, her ability to function independently, her state of mind just hours before she vanished. But the investigative value of that Uber ride extends far beyond Nancy herself. Modern rideshare vehicles, especially those driven by safety-conscious operators, often feature multiple camera systems. A rear-facing camera monitors passengers for both safety and liability purposes. Many drivers also install forward-facing dash cams to document traffic incidents and protect themselves from fraudulent claims. Some vehicles come equipped from the factory with sophisticated recording systems that capture everything happening around the car. Brian Fitzgibbons, who directs security operations for USPA Nationwide Security and has spent years finding and extracting missing persons around the world, emphasizes that investigators shouldn't just be reviewing footage of Nancy inside the vehicle. They need to examine everything captured in the background, in the periphery, In those moments when the camera records something the driver never consciously observed. Was there a vehicle behind them that seemed to be following? A car parked along the route with someone sitting inside, watching? When the Uber pulled up to Nancy's residence, were there other vehicles nearby that didn't belong in that neighborhood at that hour? These questions matter because the evidence strongly suggests that whoever took Nancy Guthrie didn't act impulsively. This wasn't a crime of opportunity committed by someone who happened to be in the area. This was planned, rehearsed, executed with precision. And if the perpetrator was watching Nancy that night, waiting for her to come home, there's a chance he's somewhere in that Uber footage, captured without knowing it, preserved without realizing it, waiting to be identified. The Uber delivered Nancy home sometime between 9 and 9:30 that evening. She entered her residence alone, a grandmother going through her normal nighttime routine, taking her medication, preparing for bed, perhaps checking her phone or watching television for a while before sleep. Her home was equipped with security measures, including a doorbell camera, the kind of system that millions of Americans install believing it will keep them safe, never imagining they might capture their own abduction. Inside her home, everything appeared normal. Her glasses sat where she always left them. Her phone remained on its charger. Her walker stood ready for the next day's use. These weren't items forgotten in a rush. These were the possessions of a woman who fully expected to wake up in her own bed the next morning. But someone else had different plans. Someone who'd been watching Nancy Guthrie for weeks, possibly months. Someone who understood her limitations, her routines, her vulnerabilities. Someone who knew she couldn't fight back, couldn't run, couldn't even walk to a neighbor's house to call for help. And here's what makes this case particularly chilling. We know this person had been there before. On January 11th, 19 days before Nancy disappeared, her doorbell camera captured footage of a suspicious individual at her door. Not someone making a delivery, not a neighbor or a friend. Someone dressed to conceal their identity, someone who had no legitimate reason to be there, someone conducting surveillance. Crime scene investigator Cheryl McCullum, founder of the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute, has examined thousands of cases over her decades-long career. She's worked everything from inner-city homicides to cold cases that have gone unsolved for generations. And one of the fundamental truths she's learned is that criminals are creatures of habit. They repeat behaviors because those behaviors work. They develop patterns because patterns feel comfortable, familiar, controlled. If you want to understand what a criminal will do next, look at what they've done before. It's muscle memory. It's ritual. It's the same reason you brush your teeth the same way every morning, take the same route to work, perform the same sequence of actions without conscious thought. So when investigators discovered that Nancy's residence had been visited by a suspicious person on January 11th, they weren't just looking at an isolated incident. They were looking at reconnaissance, surveillance, a dry run. The perpetrator was learning Nancy's schedule, testing her security system, determining whether the doorbell camera was functional or just for show, identifying the best approach, the best entry point, the best time to strike. And if he came once on January 11th, if he came again on January 30th, how many other times did he visit that went unrecorded? How many nights did he watch from the shadows, counting the minutes until lights went out, memorizing the rhythm of her life? The answer to that question might be hidden in the video footage captured along the route Annie Guthrie later identified as the probable escape path. Because if the perpetrator was watching Nancy on January 30th, he had to be somewhere in the neighborhood when that Uber dropped her off. He couldn't risk being too far away. He needed to know when she arrived home, when she settled in for the night, when she would be most vulnerable. Which means his vehicle, assuming he drove rather than walked, had to be parked somewhere nearby. A residential street, a parking lot, a side road with a view of Nancy's home. And if his vehicle was there on January 30th, it was probably there on January 11th as well. Same vehicle, same location, same waiting game. 1:27 in the morning, January 31st. Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera activated, triggered by motion at her front door. The footage shows a figure dressed head to toe in dark clothing, face completely obscured, wearing a backpack. This isn't someone making a late-night delivery or a neighbor checking on a friend. This is someone who came prepared for confrontation, prepared for extraction, prepared to remove an 84-year-old woman from her home without leaving obvious evidence of forced entry. The timestamp matters enormously. 1:27 a.m. Most of Nancy's neighbors would be asleep. The street would be quiet, empty of witnesses. The noise of a struggle, if there was a struggle, would be muffled by desert night and residential distance. But here's what makes that timeline even more significant. Nancy's Apple Watch, connected to her pacemaker monitoring system, remained active and transmitting data until 2:29 in the morning. That's a 62-minute window between the doorbell camera activation and the watch's disconnection. 62 minutes, during which something happened inside Nancy's home that resulted in her disappearance. Did the perpetrator spend that entire hour inside, controlling her, gathering items, staging the scene? Did he force her to disable security systems or provide access codes? Did he wait for her to fall asleep before entering, having somehow gained access to her home earlier in the evening? The physical evidence discovered later that morning suggests Nancy didn't leave voluntarily. Every single item she needed to function independently remained in her home. Her glasses, essential for someone with age-related vision decline, her phone, the lifeline that elderly people keep close at all times, her medications, including the heart medication that her family emphasized she needed to survive, her walker, without which she couldn't move more than 50 feet. These aren't items someone forgets during a voluntary departure. These are items that prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Nancy Guthrie did not walk out of her home under her own power with any intention of going somewhere. When Annie Guthrie discovered her mother missing on the morning of January 31st, she immediately understood what law enforcement would take hours to accept. This was an abduction. Nancy couldn't have wandered off, couldn't have become disoriented and walked away from her home. She didn't have the physical capability to do so. But the initial response from authorities treated this as a missing elderly person case, a woman who might have become confused, who might be found wandering the neighborhood or collapsed somewhere nearby. Annie fought against this characterization from the very beginning. She knew her mother. She understood her limitations. She could see the evidence right in front of her, a home that showed no signs of Nancy preparing to go anywhere, possessions that proved she'd been taken against her will. This disconnect between family knowledge and official response isn't unique to Nancy's case. Families often see what investigators miss because they understand context, patterns, deviations from normal behavior. When Gabby Petito's parents insisted something was wrong, law enforcement initially treated it as a young woman who'd chosen to go off the grid during a cross-country trip. The parents knew better. They understood their daughter wouldn't simply stop communicating. Their insistence drove the investigation forward, and when civilian sleuths spotted Gabby's Ford Transit van in dispersed camping footage, it led searchers to her remains. The family's knowledge, dismissed initially as emotional overreaction, proved accurate. In Nancy's case, the crime scene itself told the story Annie was trying to communicate. Glasses on the table, phone on the charger, walker by the door, medications in the cabinet. Every piece of physical evidence screamed abduction. Yet the initial hours of the investigation were spent searching for an elderly woman who'd wandered away. Those hours matter. In missing persons cases, especially those involving vulnerable victims, the first 48 hours are critical. That's when witnesses remember details, when surveillance footage still exists before being overwritten, when the perpetrator might still be close to the abduction site. Every hour spent looking in the wrong direction is an hour the trail grows colder. Once investigators accepted that Nancy had been taken, the focus shifted to the how and the who. How does someone remove an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility from her home in the middle of the night without leaving obvious evidence of forced entry or struggle? The answer involves either deception or control. Either Nancy was somehow convinced to open her door and allow someone inside, perhaps someone claiming to be from a medical service or security company, or the perpetrator entered through a door or window that Nancy hadn't properly secured. Given her age and limitations, it's possible she didn't or couldn't check every access point before bed. It's possible the perpetrator found an unlocked window earlier in the evening and simply waited for the right moment to enter. But however he got inside, he then had to control Nancy and remove her from the premises. The backpack visible in the doorbell footage suggests he came prepared with restraints, possibly a weapon, perhaps chemical agents to sedate or incapacitate. The 1-hour window between the doorbell activation and the Apple Watch disconnection gives him time to subdue Nancy, bind her if necessary, wait for any neighbors disturbed by noise to settle back down, then transport her to a vehicle. But which vehicle? Where was it parked? How did he get Nancy from her front door to a car without being seen? These questions bring us back to the critical importance of vehicle evidence in this investigation. Nancy couldn't walk to a vehicle. She would need to be carried or perhaps pushed in a wheelchair. Either way, the perpetrator needed to have transportation very close to her residence, close enough that he could move her quickly without being observed. But here's the challenge. Nancy lived in a residential community where unfamiliar vehicles stand out, where neighbors notice cars that don't belong. If the perpetrator parked on her street, someone might remember seeing an unusual vehicle. If he parked elsewhere and had to carry Nancy some distance, someone might have heard or seen something suspicious. Unless he was extraordinarily careful about timing and positioning, unless he'd already identified the blind spots in neighborhood surveillance, unless he knew which residents were away on vacation, which homes had cameras, which routes offered the least exposure to observation. This level of planning points to someone who'd spent considerable time studying the area, someone local, or at least familiar with Tucson, someone who understood how to move through this environment without drawing attention. The son-in-law's Honda CR-V, impounded early in the investigation, became a subject of intense scrutiny and public speculation. Why would police take Annie Guthrie's family vehicle? What could it possibly tell them about Nancy's disappearance? The answer lies in the sophisticated computer systems that modern vehicles contain. Today's cars don't just transport us from point A to point B. They record data about every trip, every start and stop, every door opening, every mile traveled. The vehicle's black box could tell investigators whether that CR-V moved after 9 p.m. on January 30th. It could confirm whether it remained parked at Annie's residence all night or whether someone took it somewhere. This matters for ruling people in or ruling people out. In any missing persons investigation, especially one involving family members, investigators have to eliminate alternative explanations. Could Annie or her husband have been involved somehow? Could their vehicle have been used in the transportation of Nancy without their knowledge? The data from that Honda's computer system would answer these questions definitively. If the car didn't move, if the trunk wasn't opened, if the doors remained locked all night, that's valuable exculpatory information. It removes one possible vehicle from consideration and allows investigators to focus elsewhere. The same principle applies to the Uber driver's vehicle. Modern rideshare drivers, especially those working late-night shifts, often equip their cars with multiple safety features, including cameras and GPS tracking systems that record every detail of every trip. But even beyond aftermarket additions, many newer vehicles come factory-equipped with what's essentially a black box, similar to those found in aircraft. These systems record speed, braking, acceleration, door openings, trunk releases, window operations. They create a minute-by-minute log of everything the vehicle does. Consider what investigators learned from Alex Murdaugh's SUV in the double murder trial that captivated the nation. The vehicle's data showed exactly when Murdaugh left the murder scene, how fast he was driving, when he slowed down, when he lowered the passenger window. That window operation, correlated with cell phone data, proved he'd thrown his wife Maggie's phone out the window while fleeing the scene. The vehicle told a story that Murdaugh couldn't explain away, couldn't lie about, couldn't manipulate. The data simply existed, time-stamped and precise, an electronic witness that never forgets and never lies. In Nancy's case, if the Uber driver's vehicle captured footage of a suspicious car following them, or parked near Nancy's residence when they arrived. That could be the break investigators need. Even a partial license plate, a make and model, a distinctive feature like body damage or unusual modifications, anything that could help identify a vehicle of interest. Because once you identify a vehicle, you can start pulling data, registration records, insurance information, owner history, and then you can start cross-referencing that data against other evidence. Does the vehicle's owner have a criminal history? Any connection to Nancy or her family? Any presence in the area on January 11th when the earlier surveillance occurred? This is where the route map provided by Annie Guthrie becomes crucial. In the early days of the investigation, while Nancy was still missing and the family was desperate for any information, Annie created a detailed map showing what she believed was the likely escape route from her mother's home. She posted this map to a neighborhood watch group, asking residents along that path to check their security cameras, to review footage from the early morning hours of January 31st, to look for anything unusual: a speeding vehicle, a car driving with its lights off, someone pulled over on the side of the road, any anomaly that might help identify the perpetrator or his vehicle. Annie's map wasn't random speculation. She knows the area intimately, understands which routes offer the quickest egress from the neighborhood, which roads would have minimal traffic at 2 or 3 in the morning, which paths would avoid the most obvious surveillance cameras. Her map identified specific landmarks along the suspected route: Lulu Walker Elementary School, Green Toes North Nail Salon, Circa 79 Salon, multiple businesses and public buildings that might have captured footage of a vehicle fleeing the area during the critical time window. But here's where the initial investigation ran into problems. Some agencies, some investigators, have an inherent bias against civilian input, especially from emotionally involved family members. They see someone in crisis, someone grasping at theories and possibilities, and they dismiss the information as unreliable. But that's a fundamental mistake. Yes, Annie Guthrie is emotionally invested. Yes, she's desperate to find her mother. But that doesn't make her geographic knowledge invalid. It doesn't mean her understanding of likely escape routes is wrong. In fact, her local knowledge might be more accurate than an investigator who doesn't live in the area, who doesn't understand traffic patterns and neighborhood layouts. The elementary school on Annie's map presents a perfect example of why her route analysis matters. Lulu Walker Elementary, like most modern schools, is absolutely covered in surveillance cameras. Post-Columbine, post-Sandy Hook, schools have become fortresses of security technology. Cameras on every corner of the building, cameras covering parking lots and playgrounds, cameras monitoring entrance and exit points. These systems typically record 24 hours a day, creating overlapping fields of view where if one camera doesn't capture a clear image, another one will. And here's the key detail. These cameras are positioned to capture everything happening on the street in front of the school, not just on school property. They're watching for threats approaching, for vehicles that don't belong, for suspicious activity in the vicinity. If a vehicle fled Nancy's neighborhood along the route Annie identified, and if that route passed Lulu Walker Elementary sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning, there's an excellent chance that vehicle was recorded. Multiple angles, possibly clear enough to identify make, model, color, maybe even a license plate. But only if investigators requested that footage quickly, before the system's hard drive filled up and started overwriting old recordings. Many commercial security systems only retain footage for 30 to 90 days before recycling the storage. After 80-plus days, some of that early footage might already be gone unless it was preserved. The nail salon on Annie's map shows even more obvious surveillance potential. Look at any photograph of Green Toes North, and you can see a camera mounted on the front of the building, aimed directly at the parking lot and the street beyond. That camera doesn't just capture customers coming and going during business hours. It records continuously, documenting every vehicle that passes, every person who walks by, every movement in its field of view. At 2:30 in the morning, there wouldn't be much to record. The streets would be mostly empty, which means any vehicle that did pass would stand out clearly in the footage, easier to identify because there's no surrounding traffic to obscure the view. This raises the question that's haunted this investigation from the beginning. With all these cameras, All this surveillance technology, all these potential digital witnesses, how has no one identified the perpetrator's vehicle after more than 80 days? Cheryl McCullum, with her decades of crime scene investigation experience, asks the obvious question. Why don't we have the car? We know approximately when Nancy was taken. We know the Apple Watch disconnected at 2:29 a.m., giving us a tight timeline. We know there are only so many routes out of that neighborhood. We know businesses and schools and intersections all have cameras. So where's the vehicle? One possibility is that the perpetrator understood the surveillance landscape better than anyone anticipated. That he'd studied camera positions during his reconnaissance visits. That he knew which routes were monitored and which weren't. That he deliberately chose a path that exploited gaps in coverage. Tucson, unlike dense urban centers, has areas where you can cut through undeveloped desert land, avoiding main roads entirely. If the perpetrator knew the area well enough, he could potentially move through the city using routes that wouldn't trigger any traffic cameras or business surveillance systems. But there's another possibility, one that speaks to the challenges of modern investigations. Video footage exists, but hasn't been identified yet, because reviewing thousands of hours of surveillance recordings is incredibly tedious, time-consuming work. You can't just fast-forward through it looking for something obvious. You have to watch carefully, noting every vehicle, checking license plates, looking for patterns. A car that appears in footage from multiple locations might be significant. A vehicle that passes the same point multiple times could indicate surveillance or circling behavior. Someone who slows down near Nancy's street or parks on the shoulder of a road near the neighborhood might be worth investigating. This kind of analysis requires fresh eyes, multiple reviewers, sophisticated software that can help identify recurring vehicles across different camera systems. It requires coordination between multiple agencies, sharing of footage and data, willingness to follow leads even when they seem minor. And it requires time, which is the one resource that becomes more precious with each passing day. Because 80 days after someone is abducted, the reality is that you're probably not conducting a rescue operation anymore. You're conducting a recovery operation. You're trying to find remains, to identify a perpetrator, to bring some measure of justice and closure to a family that's been living in agony since January 31st. Nancy Guthrie's family has endured more than 2 months of not knowing. Not knowing if she's alive, not knowing where she is, not knowing who took her or why. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and a nationally recognized journalist, has maintained relative public silence about her mother's disappearance, a privacy that speaks to the impossible position she's in. Every instinct tells a journalist to investigate, to ask questions, to demand answers. But when the victim is your own mother, when the case is active and anything you say publicly might compromise the investigation, silence becomes its own form of torture. Annie Guthrie hasn't had that luxury of distance. She's been on the ground in Tucson, fighting for her mother, pushing investigators, creating maps, coordinating neighborhood searches, refusing to accept that Nancy is simply gone. Her route map, whether investigators initially welcomed it or not, represents a family member doing what families do in crisis. Taking action, providing information, trying to help in any way possible. And as it turns out, her instincts about the importance of vehicles in this case are being validated. Fresh eyes are now reviewing footage from that Uber ride. Video from along the suspected escape route is being re-examined. Vehicle data is being analyzed. This is where crime case analyst comes in. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's demonstrate why we break down investigations step by step. Why we analyze evidence methodically, why we consider alternative theories and challenge assumptions. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, now's the time. Click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Because understanding how investigations work, how evidence connects, how cases get solved or go cold, that knowledge matters. It matters when you're trying to understand breaking news. It matters when you're serving on a jury. It matters when you're trying to make sense of the senseless. When we left Nancy Guthrie's story, investigators were beginning to understand just how critical vehicle evidence would be to solving this case. An 84-year-old woman who couldn't walk 50 yards without assistance didn't simply vanish into the desert night. Someone took her. Someone planned it, and someone used a vehicle to remove her from her home in those dark hours between 1:27 and 2:29 in the morning. The question that's haunted this investigation for more than 80 days is simple and infuriating. With cameras everywhere, with surveillance systems on homes and businesses, with doorbell recordings and traffic monitors, how has that vehicle not been identified? Annie Guthrie's route map identified multiple locations along what she believed was the killer's escape path. Each location represented a potential source of surveillance footage, a possible witness in the form of security cameras that record silently, constantly, without bias or memory failure. We examined the elementary school with its multiple overlapping camera angles. We looked at the nail salon with its front-facing surveillance system aimed directly at the street. But there's another location on that map that presents both opportunity and complication. Circa 79 Salon, a structure spanning more than 3,000 square feet that sits at a critical intersection along the suspected route. If Nancy's kidnapper chose his escape route carefully, if he'd done the same reconnaissance on camera locations that he'd done on Nancy's home and routine, he might have known about this gap in coverage. He might have timed his crime to exploit it. Or he might have simply gotten lucky, choosing a route that happened to pass a location in the middle of renovation, a blind spot he didn't even know existed. Either way, the renovation timeline needs to be established. When did the cameras come down? When were they restored? Was the system recording on January 31st in those critical hours between 2 and 4 in the morning? These are the kinds of details that don't make headlines, but can make or break an investigation. And they point to a larger question that's troubled experts following this case. Why hasn't there been a massive, organized search effort? Not just law enforcement reviewing footage and following leads, but the kind of civilian volunteer operation that we've seen in other high-profile missing persons cases. Hundreds of people walking shoulder to shoulder across the desert terrain surrounding Tucson. Teams on horseback or ATVs covering ground that's too rough for foot traffic. Search and rescue organizations deploying dogs trained to detect human remains. None of that has happened publicly. There's been no call for volunteers, no organization of community search efforts, no visible deployment of the kind of resources that families typically mobilize when someone goes missing. And here's what makes that absence particularly striking. Nancy Guthrie's daughter has one of the most recognizable faces in American media. Savannah Guthrie co-anchors The Today Show, reaching millions of viewers every morning. If she wanted to mobilize 5,000 volunteers for a search effort, she could do it with a single on-air appeal. But that hasn't happened. Why? There are really only two possible explanations. The first is that law enforcement doesn't believe Annie's route theory or any geographic search strategy would be productive. They might have information suggesting Nancy was taken far from the area, perhaps transported to Mexico, given Tucson's proximity to the Sonora border. They might have evidence indicating this crime wasn't about hiding a body in the desert, but about taking Nancy somewhere specific for reasons we don't yet understand. If investigators don't believe a local search would yield results, they wouldn't encourage families to organize one. The second possibility is darker, but more likely given the timeline. After 88 days, law enforcement may have made the determination that this is a recovery operation, not a rescue. They may believe Nancy is deceased, and that organizing massive volunteer searches would not only be unproductive, but potentially traumatic for untrained civilians who might discover remains. There's also the risk of evidence contamination. Well-meaning volunteers can destroy forensic evidence, disturb a crime scene, or create confusion about which items were present originally versus which were introduced later. But the absence of organized searches raises another question. What did the initial 911 call say? In most missing persons cases, that first call to emergency services tells investigators critical information. Who noticed the person was missing? What made them concerned? What did they find or not find at the scene? Were there immediate suspicions about foul play? Or did it initially seem like a medical emergency or wandering incident? The 911 call hasn't been released to the public, which is standard practice in active investigations. But understanding what Annie Guthrie, or whoever first reported Nancy missing, actually said to dispatchers would help answer the question of whether this was treated as an abduction from the very beginning, or whether precious hours were lost pursuing other theories. What we do know is that Annie's route map wasn't created in a vacuum. She identified specific locations, specific turns, a specific path that she believed offered the most logical escape from her mother's neighborhood. And there is forensic reasoning behind choosing those locations. Joe Scott Morgan, who's investigated more than 10,000 deaths over his career, points out something that might seem obvious but is actually critical. Every location Annie identified on that map represents a point where a fleeing vehicle would have to slow down. So at each of these intersection points, the perpetrator's vehicle would have been moving slowly enough for cameras to capture usable images. Make and model identification becomes possible. Color becomes distinguishable. License plates, if the angle is right, become readable. This is completely different from the Brian Kohberger case, where investigators were tracking a white Elantra through multiple camera angles as it moved at normal traffic speeds through residential areas. In Nancy's case, we're talking about a vehicle forced to decelerate to nearly a complete stop multiple times along a predictable route, which makes the continued absence of vehicle identification all the more frustrating. Either the cameras at these locations weren't functioning, or weren't positioned to capture the road, or the footage wasn't preserved, or investigators haven't yet identified the right vehicle among the many vehicles that passed these intersections during the relevant time period. There's also the possibility that the route Annie identified isn't the route the kidnapper actually used, though her reasoning seems sound and her local knowledge is extensive. But here's where the investigation takes an interesting turn. Dave Mack, Crime Story's investigative reporter, has been conducting his own analysis of the evidence and the geography, and he's discovered something that law enforcement initially dismissed, but that might actually validate Annie's entire approach. Several weeks ago, a Ring doorbell camera captured footage of a suspicious vehicle on a back road, approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The vehicle was traveling at an unusual hour on a road that doesn't get much traffic. When the footage was brought to the sheriff's department, it was dismissed as unrelated. Just a car on a back road, nothing connecting it to Nancy's case. But when Dave Mack overlaid that Ring camera location onto Annie's route map, something became clear. The back road where that vehicle was spotted doesn't appear on Annie's map because it's not the most direct route. But it's completely consistent with the same general area and the same directional flow. It's an alternative path that someone with local knowledge might choose, precisely because it avoids the main intersections, the obvious camera locations, the routes that any investigator would naturally examine first. This is exactly the kind of detail that gets missed in the chaos of an investigation's early days. Someone reports seeing a suspicious vehicle. It's in the general area, but not at the primary crime scene. It's on a back road that doesn't fit the most obvious escape route. So it gets noted, filed, and deprioritized while investigators chase more immediate leads. But now, months later, when that sighting gets correlated with Annie's geographic analysis and with our understanding of where cameras are and aren't located, it becomes potentially significant. The vehicle caught on that Ring camera was fleeing from the direction of Nancy's neighborhood, moving away from the area on a route that would connect to highways leading south. South toward the Mexican border. South toward areas where someone could dispose of evidence or hide a victim. The timing, while not precisely established in public reporting, was consistent with the early morning hours when Nancy disappeared. And the behavior, driving on a back road at an unusual hour, fits the profile of someone trying to avoid detection. This is why family input matters in investigations. This is why dismissing civilian theories because they come from emotionally involved parties is a fundamental mistake. Annie Guthrie created that route map because she knows the area. She understands which roads connect to which highways. She's driven these streets countless times. Her knowledge isn't based on emotion or desperation. It's based on lived experience in that community. And when independent evidence, the Ring camera footage, aligns with her analysis, it validates her approach, even if the specific route she identified wasn't the exact path the kidnapper used. What this tells investigators is that they need to expand their geographic focus, not just the most direct routes, not just the roads with the most obvious surveillance. Every alternative path within a certain radius of Nancy's home. Every back road and side street. Every route that offers a way out of the neighborhood while minimizing exposure to cameras. Because this perpetrator demonstrated sophistication in his planning. He surveilled Nancy's home multiple times. He understood her routine. He chose his timing carefully. Why wouldn't he also choose his escape route with the same level of planning? Joe Scott Morgan has examined the crime scene photographs that were taken by media after the scene was left unsecured. What he sees in those images is blood spatter with very particular characteristics. There are large deposits, roughly the size of nickels, accompanied by much smaller satellite droplets. This specific pattern, large drops with tiny secondary spatter, has only one explanation in forensic science. It's expiration blood. Blood that's been expelled from the nose or mouth mixed with air from the respiratory system. When you simply pour blood or drop it from a container, you don't get this pattern. You get a spreading pool or isolated drips. You certainly don't get the tiny satellite droplets that indicate air mixed with liquid being forcefully expelled. Morgan, with his characteristic directness, asks the obvious question. Did the killer show up with a turkey baster full of Nancy's blood and blow it onto the porch to create this exact pattern? Did he understand enough about forensic blood spatter analysis to know what expiration looks like versus what poured blood looks like? The answer, obviously, is no. The blood on that porch came from Nancy Guthrie's respiratory system while she was at that location. Whether she was struck, whether she fell, whether she had a medical crisis brought on by the attack, something happened that caused her to expel blood from her nose or mouth onto that porch. You can't stage that. You can't recreate it. The physics of the spatter pattern, the mixture of air and blood, the size distribution of the drops, all of it points to a living person in respiratory distress at that exact spot. Cheryl McCullum, examining the same evidence, points to another detail that confirms the analysis. Many of the blood drops show 90-degree angles of impact. Some have clear centers. Some have half-moon shapes. These characteristics only occur when blood mixed with air strikes a surface. The air creates the clear centers and curved edges. It's a signature that cannot be faked by transferring blood from one location and dropping it somewhere else. This is active biological evidence of Nancy being at her front porch in a condition that caused respiratory bleeding. There's also the matter of the foliage visible in some of the photographs. Viewers and analysts have questioned how plant material ended up on top of the blood if the blood was deposited first. Doesn't that suggest the blood was added later, after the leaves and flowers were already there? But the answer is simpler and directly observable in the doorbell camera footage. The perpetrator is clearly seen placing a flower arrangement or plant material over or near the camera, presumably trying to obscure the lens or create some kind of cover. During the struggle or Nancy's removal from the property, pieces of that plant material fell onto the porch. The timing sequence isn't mysterious. First the attack and blood deposition, then the perpetrator's attempt to obscure the camera, then the plant material falling where it happened to fall, which included areas where blood had already been deposited. So Bercato's staging theory, while intellectually interesting, doesn't survive contact with the physical evidence. Nancy wasn't killed elsewhere and the scene staged. She was attacked at or very near her front door. She expelled blood onto that porch from her own respiratory system. Her pacemaker monitoring system places her at that location until 2:29 in the morning when the signal terminated. The technology and the biology align. The staging theory doesn't fit. But here's what's important about theories that turn out to be wrong. They're not useless. Brian Fitzgibbons, who's spent his career finding missing persons around the world, understands something crucial about investigation psychology. Investigators can develop tunnel vision. They lock into a particular hypothesis about what happened, and they unconsciously filter incoming information through that hypothesis. Evidence that supports their theory gets weighted more heavily. Evidence that contradicts it gets rationalized or minimized. Outside perspectives, even when they're wrong, serve a critical function. They force investigators to test their assumptions against alternative explanations. When someone like Dr. Bercato presents the staging theory, it requires investigators to go back to the blood evidence and confirm what it actually shows. It pushes them to verify the pacemaker data timeline. It makes them question whether they're seeing what's really there or what they expect to see. Sometimes testing a wrong theory is what leads to breakthrough understanding of the right theory. Fitzgibbons uses a baseball metaphor. Babe Ruth struck out more than any player of his era. He also hit more home runs than anyone else. You don't get the home runs without swinging at pitches that turn out to be balls. The same principle applies to investigation. You don't crack difficult cases by only pursuing safe, obvious leads. You test theories. Some fail, some succeed. But the testing process itself moves the investigation forward. And right now, this investigation needs forward movement. Because while experts debate theories and analyze blood spatter and map escape routes, the institutional foundation of the investigation itself has become unstable. Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County, the primary law enforcement authority in this case, finds himself in what can only be described as uncharted career territory. A 10-day deadline has passed. The County Board of Supervisors demanded responses to questions about his conduct, his statements, and his handling of the Guthrie investigation. What they got instead was something considerably less than what they asked for. According to Dave Mack's reporting, Sheriff Nanos sat down with his attorney and produced what amounts to a list of excuses for various statements and actions. But critically, this response wasn't submitted under oath. It wasn't a sworn statement subject to perjury charges if proven false. It was essentially an attorney-drafted explanation of why various controversies aren't really controversies, why statements that seemed problematic were misunderstood, why actions that appear questionable actually made sense in context. It was a legal document designed to provide cover, not a transparent accounting of decisions and outcomes. Now the county board faces a decision. Do they accept this unsworn response as sufficient? Or do they haul Sheriff Nanos back in, put him under oath, and ask these questions again with the legal weight of sworn testimony? Previous accusations against Nanos include lying to the public and misusing his office during an election year. If they can establish that he failed to properly comply with their formal requests for information, they might have grounds to remove him on a technicality, even without proving the underlying accusations. For a case this high profile, with a victim connected to national media, leadership instability creates serious problems. Cheryl McCullum acknowledges the dilemma. On one hand, removing a sheriff mid-investigation typically hampers the case. A new sheriff coming in would need to review everything from the beginning, get briefed on thousands of hours of investigation, build relationships with federal partners, understand the evidence and the decision-making process that's already occurred. That takes time. Time that Nancy's family doesn't have. Time that allows trails to grow colder and witnesses' memories to fade. But on the other hand, can you really argue for continuity when that continuity involves leadership that's lost public confidence? Cheryl doesn't pull punches in her assessment of Sheriff Nanos's public statements. "Your guess is as good as mine," he said at one point when asked about aspects of the investigation. That's not the language of someone in command of the facts. When questioned about vehicle traffic in the area during the relevant time period, he claimed there were thousands of vehicles on the roads. At 2 or 3 in the morning in that part of Tucson? Thousands? It's not just an exaggeration. It's a statement that makes experts question whether he understands the basic facts of his own case. Most troubling was his public statement that he believed Nancy Guthrie was still alive. 80-plus days after an 84-year-old woman with a heart condition was taken without her medications, without her walker, without any of the support systems she needed to survive, the sheriff told media he thought she was being held somewhere. Not a single expert following this case believes that's a realistic scenario. The timeline, the medical needs, the complete absence of ransom demands or communications, all of it points to a recovery operation, not a rescue. When the primary law enforcement official makes statements that contradict expert consensus and basic logic, it erodes confidence. When he flip-flops between positions, when he provides information that's demonstrably incorrect, when he fails to secure crime scenes or respond adequately to oversight requests, the investigation suffers, regardless of how many hours his deputies are working or how many leads they're following. Joe Scott Morgan takes the 30,000-foot view on this situation. His concern isn't just about solving the case now. It's about what happens if and when they identify a suspect and move toward prosecution. Defense attorneys will have a field day with the leadership chaos. They'll argue the investigation was rife with incompetence. They'll point to the unsecured crime scene that allowed media to walk up and photograph evidence. They'll highlight contradictory statements from the sheriff. They'll suggest that evidence was missed, that leads weren't followed, that the entire investigation is tainted by institutional dysfunction. And here's the hard truth. Those arguments might work. We've seen cases collapse at trial because defense attorneys successfully argued that investigative failures created reasonable doubt about guilt. It doesn't matter if the defendant actually committed the crime if the investigation was conducted so poorly that a jury can't trust the evidence. The mistakes made at the beginning of an investigation echo through time. They create vulnerabilities that skilled defense attorneys exploit years later when the case finally reaches trial. As a college professor, Morgan tells his students that the Guthrie case will serve as a teaching example for years to come. Not an example of how to conduct a proper investigation, but an example of what not to do, how not to secure a scene, how not to communicate with media, how not to handle family relationships, how not to respond to oversight. The case is still active, still developing, and it's already a cautionary tale about how institutional failures can undermine even the most important investigations. So can this case be saved? After 88 days, after leadership controversies and missed opportunities and unsecured scenes, is there still a path to justice for Nancy Guthrie? Brian Fitzgibbons believes there is, and his reasoning offers genuine hope. The game clock metaphor is useful here. For the public, watching this case unfold in real time, 88 days feels like an eternity. For Nancy's family, every single one of those days has been unbearable. The not knowing, the waiting, the hope that wars with devastating likelihood. Time moves differently when you're living inside a tragedy. Each day without answers is its own form of torture. But here's what matters. The FBI controls the actual game clock, not the perpetrator. Federal investigators don't face the same time pressures as local agencies. They're not dealing with county budget constraints or political pressures from boards of supervisors. They don't have to worry about election cycles or public opinion polls. They have essentially unlimited time and unlimited resources to work this case, and they will work it until it's solved. The leads that have been generated number in the thousands. The digital evidence collected includes hundreds of hours of video, terabytes of data from vehicles and phones and computers. That evidence doesn't disappear. It doesn't degrade. Someone, somewhere in that massive digital haystack, is the needle that breaks this case. Maybe it's a vehicle captured in the background of footage that hasn't been fully analyzed yet. Maybe it's a cell phone that pinged a tower near Nancy's house at the wrong time. Maybe it's a financial transaction that creates a connection no one has recognized. The FBI has tools and capabilities that local sheriff's departments don't possess. Facial recognition technology that can compare the masked figure in the doorbell footage against millions of images in national databases. Vehicle identification algorithms that can scan through traffic camera footage and flag cars matching certain parameters. Forensic accountants who can trace money flows and identify financial motives. Behavioral analysts who can build psychological profiles and suggest investigative directions. Most importantly, federal investigators have the political insulation to follow evidence wherever it leads, without worrying about local consequences. If the evidence points to someone connected to local power structures, they can pursue it. If the evidence requires investigating the victim's family more thoroughly, they can do that without the same sensitivities that might constrain local detectives. They can request data from companies and jurisdictions that might be reluctant to cooperate with county-level requests. They can bring charges under federal statutes that carry more severe penalties than state equivalents. None of this means the case will be solved quickly, but it does mean hope isn't lost. Justice deferred is not the same as justice denied. Cases go cold and then break open years or even decades later when new technology allows old evidence to be examined in new ways. DNA that couldn't be tested in 2025 might be analyzable in 2030. Video enhancement algorithms that don't exist yet will exist soon. Witnesses who were too afraid to come forward today might find courage tomorrow. But there's something the public can do right now that might accelerate this timeline considerably. Someone out there knows something. Maybe you saw a vehicle that night that struck you as odd, but you didn't think to report it because it seemed insignificant. Maybe you know someone whose behavior changed around late January, who suddenly had access to money or went on an unexpected trip. Maybe you heard someone make a comment that didn't mean much at the time, but resonates differently now with everything we know about this case. If you have information, even if you think it's probably nothing, even if you're not sure it's relevant, call the tip line. The toll-free number is 800-225-5324. If you want to remain completely anonymous, use the alternate line at 520-882-7463. There is a reward of more than $1.2 million on the table. And here's what makes this reward different from many others. You don't need a conviction to collect it. You don't even need an arrest. You need information that leads to resolution of the case. Information that helps find Nancy or identify who took her qualifies.